Morning, everyone. I am going to be speaking today about Jupyter Notebooks for Ops. My objectives are to give a little bit of a history of Jupyter Notebooks and how they came to be, and the next objective is to talk about how they can be used in ways pertinent to op folks and how we can take the tool and use it. The next objective is how they can be used to kind of bridge the gap between ops folks and non-ops folks. And I will talk a little bit about what's next, as far as like what's kind of on the horizon for Jupyter Notebooks and some of its ilk. So who am I? I am without current employer, but I've been a tech professional about 20 years. I've done some sysadmin work, and I've worn many hats. I've worked in a lot of smaller environments. So I've worked in a few different industries and taken on a few different roles. Most of those roles have been in the vein of as a Linux system administrator. And one thing I enjoy is trying to use technology tools in novel ways. So when I came across Jupyter Notebooks as a way to run Python for anything from little scripts to engaging in like data science, for example, with like the pandas libraries, I thought, this is cool. Where can I sign up? And I would tell other sysadmins about what I did, and they were like, really? You can do that? What's Jupyter Notebooks? So I decided to try and talk about it. Also, this is my 5th LISA. Fifth. So what are Jupyter Notebooks? Jupyter Notebooks are open source, first of all. I'll get into that in a little bit later. It allows you to combine live code, equations, visualizations, and explanatory text. If you go out to GitHub and just get a .py file, you get code, you get comments. That's about it. But if you get a Jupyter Notebook, you get code, you get comments, you get Markdown, you might get some visualizations. So you get a little more in there with it, and like your standard Python source code, you can save it in version control. What specifically is a Jupyter Notebook, some of you might be asking? Can everybody see this okay? Okay. So Jupyter Notebooks are actually a group of multiple technologies working together. The notebook itself has a .ipynb extension, and it's JSON. It's a customized JSON. One thing you'll notice about the different tools for Jupyter Notebooks is they're all standard tools. They're all standard building blocks, like JSON, ZeroMQ, WebSockets, and Python. So you have the notebook document format, which is based on JSON. You have the interactive computing protocol, which allows the notebook server to send data to the kernel and have it process it and display it in the browser. And that's based on ZeroMQ and WebSockets. And the kernel itself, in this case, is IronPython, which was the existing project that got merged into Project Jupyter as Jupyter gained popularity. IronPython by itself, just running Python in it is, to me, in my humble opinion, is preferable to just installing Python and typing Python. It's a really interesting way to run Python. And note that I made a little comment saying more on the Python kernel later because there's some interesting nuance there. So we talked about how we get there, and here's a little more about what IPython is. And IPython's not just the piece that runs Python, it's the reference for any other kernel that can be run in Jupyter Notebooks. If you don't know, Jupyter Notebooks can run multiple languages, not just Python, not just R, not just Scala, but well over 100 languages. In my personal setup, I have it set up so that Jupyter Notebooks can run PowerShell. So you can take that flexibility and adapt it to your environment. These kernels are developed by various parties, so they may be in various states of stability, but the IPython kernel is rock solid because the Jupyter project maintains it. So to get Jupyter Notebooks on your machine, you can do a standard pip install. Personally, I use Miniconda, especially on servers. I'm starting to use I like how compact it is, so I use it on my desktops as well. As far as, I can't really speak to Python XY or SciPy or some of the other Python distributions, but you could use however you manage modules to install it that way. And here's a slight, very small public service announcement, a little bit of my opinion. Please use virtual environments for Jupyter Notebooks if you don't already, because you don't want to use system Python for applications. You will regret it. Especially if your existing system is old. And if you have any Red Hat 5 boxes, you know what I mean. Do not raise your hands. But trust me, I feel your pain. So what do you do in a Jupyter Notebook? You can run Python. You can do anything in Python in Jupyter Notebooks, but it's not just that. You end up getting runbooks with better documentation. So you could state the why and the how and the history of the commands with the commands themselves. So if you have someone who's newer to the team, you can give them the Jupyter Notebook and have them run through, run the commands and read through the documentation, because the documentation and the commands are one and the same. And this is the reason why, this is part of one of the things that was really intriguing to me about Jupyter Notebooks, experimentation and consumption of web data using things like REST APIs. REST APIs everywhere, and getting that data is relatively easy in Python. So using libraries like requests and using pandas to manipulate it, and using libraries like matplotlib to display it, you can get data insight from Jupyter Notebooks by just firing it up. You can also use Jupyter Notebooks as a presentation tool, though I have no idea who would do that. I'm actually using Jupyter Notebooks to operate this presentation. There's a module called Rise, which allows Jupyter Notebooks to leverage Reveal.js to display a Jupyter Notebook as a presentation. So we've been using Jupyter Notebooks all along. So you can do all these things, and as I mentioned before a couple times, you can do these things in languages other than Python. So when I'm talking about languages other than Python, I mean like C#, F#, and even things like Mathematica or MATLAB. However, sometimes with other languages, you will end up having dependencies, such as, for example, with Mathematica, you will need Wolfram software to run Mathematica in your Jupyter Notebooks. So when you're running Jupyter Notebooks, actually, let me start that over. So even if you may not find utility in running Jupyter Notebooks, some people on your team may. So you may have data scientists in your organization or people who use data or consumers of data who want to use Jupyter Notebooks. And you don't want to say, hey, you install Jupyter Notebooks, you install Jupyter Notebooks, you install Jupyter Notebooks. You don't necessarily want to do that. Jupyter Notebooks have advanced in how they have provided ways for Jupyter Notebooks to be hosted. And two of those are here. So Jupyter Hub is a way to have multi-user Jupyter Notebooks. Here are a couple guides. The littlest Jupyter Hub is a guide for users of 1 to 100. In fact, I am running the littlest Jupyter Hub on a server at a cloud provider to provide this presentation. So, but if you're into Kubernetes, which I know probably one or two of you are, you can use 0 to Jupyter Hub in Kubernetes and run Jupyter Hub in Kubernetes. So what's next for Jupyter Notebooks? Jupyter Lab is the newer iteration of Jupyter Notebooks. Instead of the familiar Jupyter Notebook format, which I'll show you in a little bit, it's more of an IDE type look and feel. If you use something like a PyCharm to develop your Python, you'll find it to be familiar. Also, Microsoft has gotten into the notebook game with Azure notebooks. And these notebooks are identical to, the notebook format is the same. I've taken notebooks that I've written and put them on Azure, and they run exactly as they're supposed to. One interesting part of Microsoft's offering is they, in addition to Python, they offer R and F#, which is their functional programming language. So you can write notebooks with those languages in them. And also, this one kind of threw me for a loop because this happened last week, and anybody doing data stuff in Netflix probably knows what I'm going to mention. Polynote. Polynote is an application that just got open sourced by Netflix that is Java-based, that provides notebook functionality with the default language of Scala, but it can do Python as well. So they're somewhat in the same vein. So as I mentioned before, I'm using this notebook to run the presentation. So this is how a Jupyter Notebook looks. These are cells that provide markdown language that can also be filled with Python code. And this tab right here tells me, because I'm using the Rise module, it tells the notebook, is this a slide? Is this a fragment of a slide? What is it? Why is it failing? I think that the connectivity is misbehaving. So I also have it running. I also have Jupyter Notebook installed on this local machine. As you can see, I had a Conda environment, and when you type Jupyter Notebook, it drops you into the current working directory, and you run a notebook. There's a lot more to Jupyter Notebooks. The rabbit hole gets very deep. There are lots of shortcuts within IPython that allow you to do various things, such as run command line code, system commands, and pull Python source into Python notebooks. And also, there is the notebook server is a very robust piece of software. It will allow you to take notebooks and convert them to other formats. For example, these slides could get converted to a PDF using the notebook server that's part of the Jupyter Notebooks package. Here's my contact information, and here are some references for so you can learn more about Jupyter and how to leverage it in your organization. And I'd like to thank you all for listening, and the USENIX staff and the LISA19 program committee, and all of the people who are still at work while we are here at LISA. And I'd like to thank you for if you've ever encouraged anyone to advance their knowledge, whether being a mentor or just a good boss or a parent or parental type figure. Thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you, Derek. And if you have any questions, please line up in front of the microphone to ask them. And just remember to keep your questions sort of short. Thanks.
Thank you, Derek. That was pretty cool. I've used Jupyter Notebooks before when they first came out, and I remember it was started with IronPython. Does that have anything to do with IPython? I don't know what IPython is.
IronPython, I believe, is this. Isn't that the
.NET? Yeah.
the .NET implementation of Python?
Yeah.
They are unrelated. IPython, like all the components in Jupyter Notebooks, is an open source project, and IPython is an interactive Python shell. And it's pretty much like if Bash was written to run Python things.
Okay.
It has that kind of interface.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
The littlest Jupyter notebook, we've been asked to install that, and going through the documentation, it says, this is not secure, don't run it in a production environment, blah, blah, blah. Are you familiar with the insecurities and what ramifications that have in actually deploying it?
Well, it is still beta software, so if you're in a very secure environment, you may not want to run it. You may want to look at something a little more mature, like the Azure Notebooks offering. If you have relations with Microsoft and those are good products to use, then you might want to go that route. The littlest Jupyter Hub is still, they're still working through some things on that. That's in beta, so there are concerns there, but can I ask, what is your role?
My role is system administrator.
Oh, okay. So as a system administrator, you have an idea of how, what's an acceptable risk and what's not acceptable risk. Like if this will be nowhere near a public network, that's one thing, but.
Yeah, I guess the real question is, where do the insecurities lie?
Oh, it's just because it's not 1.0 yet.
Okay, it's just not vetted out, et cetera, so.
Yeah, it's coming down the pike.
Okay.
So that's why it's kind of like, what's next? Like I will probably destroy my instance after this talk. Not because it did anything bad, but just because.
So related to the security aspects of Jupyter Notebook, is there a way to run Python in like a more sandboxed environment with it? Because I assume the biggest concern is HTTP to Python, which can create processes and do all sorts of things on the host machine, like with the OS module, for instance.
Well, one way that, like if you're running standard Jupyter Notebook, one way that's mitigated is that it's when you run Jupyter Notebook, it's only on localhost. So in that particular instance, you don't unless localhost is compromised. If localhost is compromised, all bets are off. But if you don't really have to worry about that if you're just running it localhost style. But if you're running it on, like let's say I put Jupyter Notebook on a server and I'm running it on a server and I open it up to a public IP, you'll want to do the normal things that you do to secure any web app. I mean, things like, you can do things like certificates. So you could say, issue certificates and say, okay, if you don't have this certificate, you cannot access Jupyter Notebooks. That would actually that'd be a pretty cool thing to talk about for someone that's way more versed in certificates than I.
Well, maybe we'll hear about it at your next talk. Thank you so much, Derek.
Thank you.